Have you ever been humiliated in front of everyone and had to pretend it didn't hurt because you needed that job to eat? Have you ever tasted the bitter mud, not just on your body but in your soul, while someone laughed at your pain? If so, write in the comments, "God sees me," because this story, though it may seem like many the world ignores, is about something the heavens have never failed to see. On that cold Thursday morning, the overcast sky seemed to reflect Clara's heart. As she walked with small steps along the sidewalk of Ashford Tower, the most imposing building in the city, she wore her worn grey uniform, rubber gloves on her hands, and a pair of old boots that barely kept out the dampness of the soaked ground. She was the cleaner on the 12th floor. But that day, she was called to clean the main entrance because the regular cleaner was sick. She couldn't have imagined that it would be right there in front of the wrong eyes, but also the right ones, that her destiny would change. Clara was only 27, but she carried the weight of the world's wrinkles on her shoulders. Orphaned since she was 9, she had been raised by a distant aunt who always reminded her she was a burden. She learned to stay silent, to clean without making noise, to swallow her tears when loneliness gripped her chest. She had worked in that building for 3 years, and no one ever knew her name. To everyone, she was just the cleaning lady. Then, on that day, an old burgundy Mustang pulled up in front of the main entrance, its gleaming paint outshining even the grey morning light. From inside, Mrs. Isadora Blake, 78, a widow for 2 decades and heiress to one of the region's most traditional families, stepped out slowly. She wasn't just rich, she was feared. She wore a red wool overcoat, Italian leather shoes, black velvet gloves and a pearl necklace as old as her arrogance. Clara lowered her head when she saw Isadora approaching. She continued cleaning the muddy puddles left by the wheels of other cars, trying to be invisible. But sometimes the invisible shines brighter than imagined. Just as she stepped to the side, Clara accidentally brushed against one of the elderly woman's shoes, who misstepped and let out a sharp cry. She didn't fall, but the hem of her pants was splashed with dirty water. The look she shot at Clara was icy lightning. "Are you blind or just incompetent?" she spat, loud enough for the security guard at the entrance and the driver nearby to hear. Clara tried to explain, but her voice was too small. Isadora looked around and, with a harsh gesture, grabbed Clara's shovel leaning against the wall. In a cruel motion, she flung a stream of mud onto the cleaner, covering her shirt and part of her face. "There, now we're even, don't you think?" she sneered mockingly before entering the building. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. Clara said nothing. She just lowered her head, took a deep breath and went back to cleaning, even as she trembled inside. But what no one noticed was that someone had recorded everything. On the 3rd floor, behind the curtain of a discreet office, Mr. Samuel Reinhardt watched in silence. Owner of half the properties on the avenue, including Ashford Tower, he rarely appeared in public. With neatly trimmed white hair, a dark blue suit, and the serene gaze of someone who had seen it all and still felt moved. Reinhardt was no ordinary billionaire. He had the odd habit of walking without bodyguards, listening before speaking, and helping without fanfare. He had requested the discreet installation of new cameras on the building's facade 2 weeks earlier, citing security. But that morning his eyes were there in person, watching not just the scene, but the spirit with which it unfolded. And something in his expression hardened. That same afternoon, Clara was called to the management office. She thought she was going to be fired. She entered with her eyes lowered, already preparing to apologize. But she found a surprise. On the desk was a paper bag with a new clean uniform, a pair of waterproof boots, and a small box with a note. "You were seen." That was all. But her legs nearly gave out. The next day, her badge had been changed. Instead of cleaning assistant, it now read Assistant Hygiene Supervisor. No one understood. Not even the manager who handed her the new badge could explain. They only said it was a direct order from above. But Clara understood. Someone had seen her, and someone thought she deserved more. Meanwhile, Isadora began to notice small signs of discomfort. First, the elevator took longer to respond when she called it. Then, the flowers in the lobby, always replaced with white lilies, her personal preference, had been swapped for sunflowers. And finally, when she requested her car in advance, the driver informed her that it had been reassigned that day, by order of the administration. It was as if the building, silently, was turning its face away. But she didn't care, until a week later, as she arrived in the main lobby for a meeting with the building's board, She found a TV screen on the central table, playing on a loop, in silence, the recording of the mud incident. Her, throwing the shovel. Clara, motionless. The security guard's faces expressionless, and beside the TV a small sign. Justice begins in silent gestures. Isadora's face paled. Her hand trembled slightly on her carved wooden cane. For the first time in many years, and she felt shame. But what hit her hardest wasn't the video. It was seeing Clara in her new uniform, calmly cleaning the entrance glass. And when their eyes met, Clara didn't look away. Nor did she smile. She simply nodded, a gesture of respect that said, "I am whole. And you?" From that day on, something began to change, not just in Clara, but in the entire building. In the weeks that followed, Clara started noticing details she'd never seen before. The janitor, who had always treated her with indifference, now greeted her with a respectful nod. The receptionist, who used to look over her shoulder, began asking if she wanted coffee. Even the doorman, who once seemed oblivious to her, now held the door open with a discreet smile. It was as if the entire building was being silently taught by an invisible force, a force that began the moment someone chose not to stay silent in the face of injustice. Mr. Reinhardt never spoke to Clara directly. He never introduced himself, but every morning he passed through the lobby at exactly 8:03 a.m., and whenever he saw Clara, he made a subtle gesture, a slight tip of his hat, a discreet nod, a firm look. It was his way of saying, "Keep going, I see you." Outside, the world remained the same. But inside that building, Clara was blooming. She began studying at night with the help of an education voucher that mysteriously appeared in her name. She got a new locker in the changing room, where she found a letter signed only with an R at the end. "Be the bridge for those who come after you. Don't stay silent. Your story matters." Meanwhile, Isadora Blake could no longer sleep well. She began hearing whispers as she passed through the hallway. She felt the weight of judgmental stares, even if no one said anything. She tried to maintain her posture, her firm tone, her imposing presence, but inside, everything seemed to be crumbling. And what hurt her most wasn't the loss of others' respect. It was the weight of looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing the woman she saw. On a rainy Saturday morning, Isadora appeared in the lobby earlier than usual. She wore no makeup, her hair tied back simply, and a plain grey coat. She approached Clara as she washed the windows, hesitating for a moment. The two stood face to face. The scene seemed frozen in time. There was no audience, no cameras, just two women and a story that needed an ending. Isadora began, but her voice faltered. She tried again. "I was cruel to you, and I know I can't erase what I did, but I want to apologize." Clara remained silent for a few seconds. Then she took off her gloves, wiped her hands on the cloth at her waist and extended her hand. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "But I already forgave you the day you dirtied me. What you threw at me didn't define me. It only revealed me." Isadora clasped her hand firmly, her eyes filling with tears. For the first time, the woman everyone feared bowed. And then, in the midst of that silent conversation, a boy approached. He was the son of the florist in the building and held a flower in his hand, a small white dahlia. He handed it to Clara and said simply, "My mum said you're a strong woman. This flower is for you." Clara smiled, touched, and knelt to hug him. To her, that was worth more than any promotion. That afternoon, at the end of her shift, Clara found a small carved wooden box on her desk. Inside was a pair of custom-made shoes, and at the bottom of the box, a note with an embroidered phrase, "To walk in places you once thought you didn't deserve." The following week she was promoted again. Now she would be responsible for training new cleaning staff, creating workplace dignity protocols, and attending monthly board meetings. The entire building knew, and somehow everyone seemed proud. As for Isadora, she made a silent decision. She sold her expensive car, let go of her driver, and started taking public transportation to the building. She began frequenting the neighborhood's small community library and funding scholarships for at-risk youth. No one knew, but Mr. Reinhardt did, and that was enough. A month later, something symbolic happened. Reinhardt organized an internal event in the building to celebrate the lives of the invisible. It was a silent tribute to the employees who kept the building running, from the janitors to the maintenance staff, from the cleaners to the coffee servers. In the center of the lobby, they set up a small display with old photos, old uniforms, and symbolic objects, and in the middle of it all a panel where each employee could write, in their own words, what it meant to be seen. Clara wrote, "Being seen is when pain isn't ignored, and dignity doesn't need to be shouted to exist." Her phrase was the most photographed of the event, and at the closing, Mr. Reinhardt quietly took the small stage. With a steady, firm voice, he said, "Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it watches in silence and waits for the right moment. But it comes, and when it does, it doesn't punish, it transforms." Everyone applauded, and among the faces in the crowd was Isadora, sitting in the back row, her eyes full of tears, a white dahlia brooch pinned to her coat. Clara's story became a living legend told in the building's hallways. New employees sought her out with their eyes, wanting to learn from her. Even the most skeptical began to respect her presence as something almost sacred, because in that woman with firm steps and a gentle voice lived something no money could buy, the strength of someone who wasn't avenged, but was honored. And whenever someone asked if it was all real, Reinhardt would just smile and say, "Some seeds bloom in the mud, but it's not the mud that defines them, it's the light that reaches them." Months passed and Clara continued her path in silence. She didn't seek revenge or applause. Her victory was in the everyday, the looks from colleagues who now called her by name, the silent respect of the elevator operator who held the door for her, the small notes left discreetly by interns and receptionists. "You inspire me. I stopped staying silent after seeing what they did to you." But time, ever subtle, was preparing one final scene. On a sunny spring morning, the entire building was surprised by an unusual announcement. There would be a special ceremony in the rarely used inner garden. All employees were invited. Attendance was optional, but few dared not to show up. The invitation didn't specify the reason, just an embroidered phrase on the paper. Some stories deserve to be sealed with flowers. Clara arrived early. She wore a simple beige dress, her hair loose and the shoes she'd been given months before. She carried a small notebook where she'd written some of her memories, not to publish, but to remind herself of who she had been and who she had become. Upon entering the garden, she found a transformed space, wooden benches arranged in a circle, small pots with white dahlias decorating every corner, and in the center, a stone plaque covered with a white cloth. People arrived one by one. Employees, residents, a few executives. Reinhardt appeared last as always. When everyone was settled, he approached the covered plaque, looked around and said, "In some places, justice is done in silence, and the greatest revolutions happen with kindness. Today we celebrate one of those revolutions." With a calm gesture, he removed the cloth. The plaque read, "Clara's Garden, where dignity blooms even after the mud." The silence was complete. Clara covered her mouth with her hands. Her eyes filled with tears. No one had ever named anything after her. She had never been honored in her lifetime. She was the cleaner, the invisible one, the one who cleaned behind the doors. But now, she was fertile ground for hope. Reinhardt then took an envelope from his pocket. He opened it and read, "I am Clara, and I was invisible for years. But I learned that silence is not absence, it is strength. That the mud didn't define me, it only tested me. That what was done to me wasn't the end, it was the beginning." He paused, looked at her and concluded, "This text was written by her and will forever be part of this place." The applause wasn't deafening, it was restrained, respectful, emotional, because in that moment, more than joy, there was reverence. The awareness that they were witnessing something rare, dignity being recognized, not with fireworks, but with flowers. Clara walked to the center of the garden, knelt before the plaque, and planted a new dahlia seedling with her own hands. As she did, she looked back and saw Isadora, standing, holding a small watering can. Without a word, Isadora approached, knelt beside her, and watered the newly planted flower. The two remained in silence for long seconds, but in that image, redemption was sealed. As they left, each employee received an envelope. Inside was a small note with a message. The justice that transforms doesn't shout, it whispers, and when it whispers, it changes everything. Some kept the note in their wallets, others pinned it to their home bulletin boards. But everyone left changed. In the months that followed, Ashford Tower was renovated in small details. an Employee of the Month wall was replaced with a Gestures of Kindness wall, where real stories were shared. The old break room was renamed Clara's Space, decorated with plants and soft lighting. And once a month a coffee gathering was held exclusively for the cleaning, security and maintenance staff, where they could suggest improvements, share their stories and be heard. Clara began being invited to speak at other companies, always discreetly, sharing her story with entire teams. She never used a microphone. Her calm voice was enough. Because when she spoke, everyone felt something within them being reorganized. Isadora, meanwhile, was no longer the woman she once was. She sold part of her assets and founded a small NGO to support women in vulnerable situations. She called it House of Dahlias. She never told anyone where the name came from, but in a frame at the entrance was an image of two women kneeling before a newly planted flower. No caption, no explanation. And Reinhardt remained who he always was. The man who sees in silence, who acts without fanfare. When questioned by a journalist about his role in the case, he simply replied, "I didn't do anything grand. I just didn't close my eyes." Clara now walks with firm steps. She still works. She still cleans. But she is heard. She is sought out. She is finally seen. And whenever she sees someone being ignored, she approaches with kindness and offers the same phrase she once received, "You were seen." Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. It wasn't about tearing down those who humiliated. It was about lifting up those who were humiliated. And the strongest proof that justice exists is when the heart that was wounded chooses to keep loving. If this story touched you, write in the comments, God's justice is silent but infallible. Because perhaps today you're still in the mud. But believe, God is still watching. And someone powerful may be watching right now. Exactly what they're doing to you. And when the right time comes, flowers will bloom from the ground they trampled.